Hello, everybody, and welcome to Poems for People Who Hate Poetry. And today I hope that I have you not hating William Blake as we go through one of his more, for a progressive and lefty as William Blake was. And, he was one of the early romanticists, and he was this guy who was lauding against how horrible the London streets were and how it was, an industrial revolution was destroying everything and yada, yada, yada. He really, in this poem that we're going to read, called London, he really goes after and, makes you see the dirtier and nastier side of London. Now, this is this is one of the things Jordan Peterson, the psychologist and very controversial figure today, talks about someone with what's called a high openness and the big five personality traits, that you can actually identify someone's likely political leanings based on a personality trait. So if they act a certain way, or if they have a certain personality trait, they are more likely to be a lefty, for instance. So if you're very high in openness, you're more likely to be lefty. That's not 100%, and it's but it's true. Like, I'm actually very high. When I did it, I was like 97th percentile with high. But I don't consider myself left or right. So I put myself way in a weird position. But the point is that you can, with pretty good accuracy, I think, according to Peterson, have that. Now, the point is that when we're going in to talk about these romantics, he is a romantic poet, William Blake. We need to think about the time that they're writing in and, what they're trying to convey to the people who are reading at that time, and to some degree for all time. So I wanted to actually read the introduction to Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I think I'm saying that correctly. My grandmother's French, and she would always correct me when I told her the name of this. I think that's correct. Okay, so let's see if I can find. So I think Victor Hugo is one of the arch romanticists, and he was definitely, someone who was a progressive. And I think a lot of these romantics wanted to fix society to some degree. They wanted to make things better in society, and they, and they are always defined by their high emotions. They put whims and emotions above reason and rationality. Now, I think that they definitely did do that, but I think, there's a really good argument to be made as to why I think their art of, whether it's poetry or especially in drama like Les Miserables and Victor Hugo and Schiller and many of these romantics, why they were actually some of the most rational and superior pieces of artwork in and of itself in the history of the world to some degree. I mean, they had an amazing art, not just from a craft standpoint, but for Victor Hugo, for instance, I think he was one of the great dramatists of all times. So here, but they were progressives, and this is going to be very relevant for the poem London by William Blake, so you can kind of get an idea of his agenda, because he had a little bit of an agenda. He was an artist who tried to create something for people, but he was definitely a lefty, in our terms, that you could say lefty progressive. He wanted to stop the Industrial Revolution. He wanted to stop capitalism and so on. We'll talk about that. But here's Victor Hugo in the introduction, very famous introduction. So long as there shall exist, by reason of law and custom, a social condemnation which, in the face of civilization, artificially creates hells on earth and complicates a destiny that is divine with human fatality. So long as the three problems of the age, the degradation of man by poverty, the ruin of woman by starvation, and the dwarfing of childhood by physical and spiritual night, are not solved, so long as in certain regions social asphyxia shall be possible. In other words, and from a yet more extended point of view, so long as ignorance and misery remain on earth, books like this cannot be useless. I think, whatever your, political leanings are, one of we shouldn't forget that, even if you're very conservative, that there is a value to the viewpoints of progressives and people on the left who see pain and misery, and, they see prostitution destroying the lives of women, or they see, children left destitute, on the streets, or, put into child labor camps or something. And, in the poem that we're about to read, you're going to see a reference to chimney sweepers. So even though reality is that capitalism eliminated child labor, none of that matters, because the reality is, as an artist, these artists saw these injustices, and, as an artist, they expressed it in a certain way, either in a poem, a painting, a, epic novel like Les Miserables. This is actually part one. There's 2 parts. So this thing is it's the same size of 2 books. And, so it's a big boy. And so they had a certain agenda, although it was an emotional reaction that they saw, that they were reacting to, the limits of the imagination, that they felt there was like this encroaching on their imagination. And instead of binding themselves in, these romanticists burst out with these amazing, epic, dramatic scenes. And, with Victor Hugo, for instance, with those three problems of the age, you get people like Gwynplaine from the novel The Man Who Laughs, which is an amazing novel, where you get this idea of the dwarfing of the child. And that's the idea of the dwarfing of spiritual and physical dwarfing of the child. And he talks about the Comprachicos, which is, if you want to know what that is, you got to read it. Victor Hugo claims that that's a historical reality. I can't believe that was a historical truth, what happened to those children. Les Miserables, of course, everyone knows that. If you know the musical, Hugh Jackman was the last, was the big Jean Valjean. And, in that story, you get a lot of this degradation. You get Gavroche, which was the street urchin, and you get Fantine and Cosette. And Fantine, of course, is a very dramatic story that happens with Fantine. If you know, not just from the musical only touches on it. She's the one who sings I Dream a Dream. That kind of gives you a little bit of the emotion of the character of Fantine. But when you see the entire story of this man who, takes her away when she's a teenager and tells her that he's going to love her and take care of her, and then leaves her destitute and starving with a child where she has to really work hard. And then she's, society kicks her out even more. And that's kind of the message that Victor Hugo is trying to portray in this play, or in this novel. And then, of course, you have Notre Dame de Paris with Claude Frollo, and the constraints of an overpowerful church, but also the not just the church, but the emotional constraints of dogma. So all these romanticists were trying to throw off the shackles of what happened before them. Whether this is correct ideologically or incorrect doesn't matter. But what we get from this is a deeply passionate, portrayal of humans and the struggles that humans have to go through and the suffering they have to endure in order to come to a better place. So, and of course, all of these poets and authors and novelists and playwrights were all very mixed. Like I don't think there were too many pure romanticists, maybe a little bit in Germany, but not so much but I think Victor Hugo's very mixed. I think, he has very rational, plot-oriented novels, and even though he definitely rails against, capitalism, what makes an artist, especially a great novelist and poet, what makes like a great novelist so valuable is, if they're truly great, is their ability to empathize even with the people they disagree with. So when Victor Hugo is creating characters that he definitely disagrees with, whether they're evil capitalists or whether they're evil, what can we say, like even Javert, who represents society, there's still a semblance of humanity, and he's doing his duty, and you can respect Javert as this person who is just trying to do what he believes is correct. he just cannot contend with what he's doing is destroying the lives of all these people. He's destroying Javert and Cosette and Fantine, and he's basically, and that is a representation of a broader issue in society. Okay, so enough on the prelude. I wanted to give you just a little bit of a view or an idea of Romanticism, just some little inkling of what these guys were going after when we go into the poem London by William Blake. Now, real quick, before I read it, I'm just going to give you a couple very brief overviews of the history of this time. For this poem, you don't, like for any great poem, you don't have to have the history well known. But especially a poem like this, I think it does help a little bit to have at least a teeny bit of background. So in 1789, if you may know, was the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution essentially upturned the monarchy at that time, and you get Robespierre, and you get eventually, this will come later, but you get eventually Napoleon, who is comes from the people. He's explicitly not a king. He's explicitly not of the lineage of monarchs and these oppressive despots, which everyone was fighting against. Of course, this happened several years after the American Revolution, who threw off the shackles of King George, and they were able to do that. And so that was, I think, served as a little bit of an inspiration of like, if these primitive Americans can do it, why can't we do it in Europe? So anyway, you get this overturning of the monarchy in France. Now, imagine you're in Europe, right? You're monarchs in other places in Europe, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in England. Well, you might start to freak out a little bit because, especially in 1793, people in France things started to get really bloody very quickly, actually. And they started cutting off heads. They started killing the kings and the princes and anybody they can get at that was of monarch bloodline, right? So if you're in England and you're a monarch, you might start to freak out if you saw any inkling of that. And, William Blake did believe that and did like the overturning in the 1789 French Revolution. He was a radical, William Blake. Now, the point I'm making here is that when he writes this poem, it's part of William Blake's most famous poetry, which we've been reading a lot, is Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, showing the two contrary states of human nature. And when you read Poems of Innocence, which are great little poems, there's a depth to them that is, they look simple on the surface, but there's a depth to them that, is worth digging out the depth that they have. It's very interesting stories, very interesting poems. I really recommend them. I've read a couple already, but those and the Songs of Experience to some degree are kind of pitched to the public as, children's poems. And part of what I think Blake is trying to do is get past some of the bad things that are happening in London or in England. So because of this despotic overturning or the monarchical overturning in 1789, you get in England a cracking down on the freedom of press. And then, of course, if you're Blake and you're starting to see and hear about all these horrible things, this industrialist took over this farm to put a mill up of some sort. And in The New Jerusalem by William Blake, he calls these the dark satanic mills that are, just gobbling up the green pastures of England. And eventually we're just going to be all steel and nothing but steel, which has been a fear of the romanticists and the anti-industrialists since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it's still, of course, a fear today. We call it global warming today. Okay, so I'm going to read London by William Blake, and then we'll go do a quick little, line by line of it and see what you think. Okay, London by William Blake. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How chimney sweepers cry, and every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So you're I hope seeing some of the vices or the errors, the terrors, and the underbelly that he's trying to show in London. And you get this with progressives today who, will never focus on the good stuff. They're always focusing on all the horrible things. There was a book recently released that I have not read, but I've heard a lot of people talking about and reviewing, including Yaron Brook on the Yaron Brook Show, which is Enlightenment Now, and it's by Steven Pinker. And it's basically about how things are actually way better than they've ever been throughout the history of the world. Way better. Like even school shootings. Like when we think of school shootings, we probably imagine it's the end of the world and everybody's dying. But when you think, if you relate it to school shootings over the past 100 years or so, it's actually been going down overall. Crime's been going down. Death in general has been going down. Poverty has been going down worldwide, not just in America, but worldwide, been going down dramatically. And we don't really talk about that. Now, progressives in general, and I think this is just a cognitive bias, and it's, whether you want to call it like Jordan Peterson does with the, personality trait that they're going to be more leftist. I think there's a mixture of things, but the point of the fact of the matter is that there tends to be a focus on these negatives, that there's these bad things, and one bad thing that was happening in London at this time was, when you think about smoke and pollution, air pollution, and people are complaining about air pollution in 2018 America sometimes. I was when I was in college, I think it was like 2009 or 10, I remember taking a biology class. I sat next to this young lady, and she's, talked about how horrible the little bit of, there's like I don't remember what it was called. It was like a little dust of pollution, air pollution that you could actually see in Denver. And, she was right. It wasn't the nicest thing to experience, but that little, dust was nothing compared to what I remember when we, I'm from Fremont, California. It's Northern California. When my parents would always go visit family in LA. And when you went there in the late 80s, early 90s, that was fog. I remember they would always roll up the windows like that. There was a lot of fog at that time. That was nothing compared to the fog that London experienced at this time, because this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, before any kind of safety measures are in place, before they even have the technological know-how to eliminate those kind of safety measures. So there is a legitimate problem that, Blake is kind of railing and fearing at this point. So when he says, so let's go through this a little bit. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. Now, he's throwing this word chartered in your face. So there's something to the word chartered. When a poet like Blake repeats something, you got to take notice. So chartered is a word that can mean a couple of things. It can mean like a charter, a map charter. It can mean like a government charter. A legal document is kind of one of the definitions. So I think what he's trying to describe here with the chartered street and chartered is, even though Thames is a river, like it's natural, I think it's a natural river. I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but I think it's a natural river. But he's trying to argue that that this whole nature is being created by the government, which is kind of, I wander through each chartered street. So it's like, you get your government documents, and you can think of this, Marxist terror of these, people just walking down the street enslaved to their government masters, and they're getting, it's like a dystopian novel that he's kind of setting up here. Near the chartered Thames does flow. So he's by this street that's government owned, government created, government everything. And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So this is, when you think about it, it's a little bit of a terror that this poet is seeing in people's eyes, and it's a terror from the mind of the poet. So he's saying, so he's wandering through the streets, and he's marking in every face. So he's either creating the mark on people's faces, or he's recognizing that there's a mark on people's faces. And think of like an actual mark on people's faces. Now, what kind of mark? So think of like a horror movie. This is how I look at it. As a horror movie that you walk through and you have some curse put on you, where every once in a while you'll see like a demon in someone's face, right? Like just imagine people walking and have normal Kirk face, and then all of a sudden, you have this ugly face that kind of transforms. You could picture like a movie, special effects putting on like a mask or some kind of screaming, scary ghost demon. That's kind of how I think he's talking about this. And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, by the way, I am, as I'm analyzing this, in your first read through, you would not get what I just said. What I just said about the terror, the demon, comes from an overall view of the poem. And I say this all the time. It's so important to get one or two or even 3 or 4 readings and thinking about the poem yourself before you go through and really try to analyze it a little bit, because a good poem is about the whole, WHOLE. It's about everything. It's all one piece. Okay, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So now, think about those, the 3 problems of the age that Victor Hugo talked about. So we had the degradation of man by poverty, the ruin of women by starvation, and the dwarfing of childhood by physical and spiritual night. So we're going to see all of that. So here we have in every cry of every man. So why are men crying? Well, maybe it has something to do with the chartered themes and the fact that everything's chartered, and there's a kind of alienation in their soul, right? Like they are alienated from their natural pastoral, playing in the jungle or in the woods with some nymphs. Like that life, that world is gone. In every cry of every man, and every infant's cry of fear, in every voice and every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Now that is a hell of a line. I mean, that is a great image. Mind-forged manacles. So manacles are, what you put on your, they're handcuffs essentially, except they're the handcuffs that you would, oh man, what is the name? I forgot the name of the police in England. But anyway, so the name that the police, the guards of the Europe of that time, that they would put you in manacles, and then you're going to jail, right? But he's saying it's not just the manacles, like literal manacles. He's taking that they're mind forged manacles, they're metaphorical manacles, and this is what's causing. So to some degree, there's an arbitrariness to it, or fakeness to the cries of man and the infant's cry. Like it doesn't have to happen. It's optional. You can throw off these manacles and go out to the pasture is kind of what I see as one of his messages. But yet we live in this society, and we, by living in this society, we have given up the freedom of our souls. And that's what I think he's trying to say there. So how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So chimney sweepers were a real thing, where young children were put up into chimneys because they were small and they could sweep. Now, most people who have studied a little bit of the history of the Industrial Revolution understand that, 1, this was real, and 2, that it was actually capitalism that eventually ended. As people became wealthier, they stopped sending their kids and making their kids do this. But nevertheless, this was a terrible, horrible thing to see a child stuck into, a coffin-like tube that they had to clean. And, he's talking about how, clean with a brush and you get dust in your face. I mean, imagine just being in this little enclosed tomb as a child. And then you have to sweep the soot out of it, be a chimney sweeper because they didn't have any mechanized things that could do that. Kids must have died of lung cancer and lots of horrible things. So it was not a good thing that happened, even for a short while. So we have to remember that, even though, if you're on the right politically, or if you believe in those, whatever you want to, libertarianism or you're capitalist, whatever, objectivist, we have to remember that for the individual child that had to do that during that transitionary period, that is not a good thing. This is not a happy thing. And, I think William Blake is trying to express that. And, he's also kind of implying that the church did not help here, because the chimney sweeper cry, every blackening church appalls. So it seems like the church isn't really doing its job, and it's actually helping or making the kids do this. And then, of course, the soldier sighs, run in blood down palace walls. I think the hapless soldiers, I think it's like a soldier that doesn't know any better, doesn't know what he's doing. He's just or doesn't know why he's doing something, and just kind of, helps with run down the blood running down palace walls. That may be a reflection on, the killing of so many people, both monarch and non-monarch, in France at that time. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So we're getting this idea here of, in this last stanza, that the thing that he sees the most is the feminine side, the female side of all these harlots, these prostitutes, is what a harlot would be. How the youthful harlot, so they're young harlots, they're young prostitutes, which basically implies, especially at this time, that their life was essentially over in a large degree. Like they were not going to marry a good man and settle down and have a family. Once you are marked as a prostitute, marks of fear, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Once that happens to you, for the most part, it's a mark that you cannot remove ever. It's a curse. The harlot's curse, and then blasts the newborn infant's tear. So now, of course, what you get is a whole, burst of new children that are being born. And then what do people do with those children? Well, they just throw them out to the society to raise on their own, basically. I mean, this is the story of Gavroche in Les Miserables. I don't remember if he's born from a prostitute, but the idea is that a lot of these young children that are running around in France, and the same thing in London, they're the byproduct of the loss of treating women properly, and they're also the confluences. So since we don't have the pastoral farmland ethic anymore, we all cram together in London. Well, that gives a rise of prostitution, which gives a rise of all these kids. And again, this is a real problem. It's a problem today too. I mean, these are real things that need to be at least considered, even if you're a big advocate of capitalism and so on, which I am. And blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So I think the implication there is that so many men are cheating on their wives, and which implies not only possibly bringing in disease into the house, but also destroying the marriage, the sanctity of the marriage, and not cheating and things of that nature. Okay, so that's London by William Blake. I hope you enjoyed that. I really recommend reading it. I recommend reading Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience by William Blake, and really trying to get a hold of these romanticists. I think there's a lot that they can teach us about how to see the world. Thank you.